Okay, and we got 10:01 here, and we do have a quorum. Okay, then we'll go ahead and get started, and we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Will everyone please join me in the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. It's so much better doing that in person. All right, so let's go ahead. It's good to see everybody. It's been a while, so good to see everybody's faces this morning. We'll go ahead and start with roll call, please.
Just a few housekeeping items before roll call. As you may have just heard, this meeting is being recorded. For our committee members, if you are not speaking, please be sure to mute yourself. And for any member of the public wishing to make a public comment today, please use the raise your hand feature in Zoom or press *9 if you're participating telephonically. All right, directors, when I call your name, please indicate if you are present. Director Bernasconi.
Here.
Burris.
Progress.
I'm sorry, Director Burris, can you indicate if you're here? Absent. Frericks. Absent. Director Gog.
Yes.
Lozano.
Here.
Middleton.
Here.
Stollard.
Here.
Thomas. Absent. Vice Chair Kozlowski. Absent. And Chair Saragosa.
Here. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the public communications portion of this meeting. Any person wishing to address the committee on any item not on the agenda may do so at this time. Do we have any public comments?
There are no public comments.
All right. We will move right along to the consent calendar to approve the minutes of the June 7th, 2021 committee meeting.
Stallard moves approval.
Second. Right. We have Stollard moved by Director Gog. Thank you. Any questions? All right, seeing none, roll call, please.
All right, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi.
Yes.
Burris. Absent. Frericks. Absent. Gog.
Yes.
Lozano.
Aye.
Middleton.
Aye.
Stollard.
Aye.
Thomas. Absent. Vice Chair Kozlowski. Absent. And Chair Saragosa.
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right, thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and move to our action items. And our first item today is the update on Assembly Bill 1401. And Dov has this for us this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to share my screen if possible here. Okay. Good morning, committee members. This is an action item seeking a recommendation from this committee that the board take a support position on AB 1401. AB 1401 would remove minimum parking requirements on developments that are located near high-frequency transit. I'm going to give a relatively brief presentation here, so we have ample time for discussion, but I'm going to cover what the bill does and the rationale behind the policy. So the intention of AB 1401 is to roll back government-mandated parking requirements, which require developers to build a minimum number of car parking spaces as a part of their project. The bill would only apply if the project is near high-frequency transit. There's a map in your packet, which is also provided here, that shows where this bill would touch parking requirements. The scope of the bill has been amended a few times, each time reducing the affected areas to a smaller geography. The current language in the bill limits the affected areas largely, in our region at least, to transit corridors in the city of Sacramento and Sacramento County, and to a little bit of a lesser extent in Rancho Cordova, Folsom, Citrus Heights, and Roseville. If enacted, projects in these green areas would not be subject to a minimum parking requirement. Now, to be clear, that does not mean that no parking can be built. It just means that developers would be able to decide for themselves how many spaces they would provide. SACOG has spent a lot of time on the topic of housing affordability and how to accelerate housing production in the last couple of years. Starting back in 2019, we had a couple of guest speakers, one from the academic and one from the local development community, speak to the board about making infill pencil in suburban corridors. And 2 of their 8 takeaways from their analysis were to reduce parking requirements and then to reduce parking requirements again. Since then, SACOG has developed several resources exploring the suite of challenges to building infill multifamily housing, including our most recent, which is the Mind the Gap Housing Initiative, which we've talked about. But also we have a housing policy toolkit. We have a commercial corridors policymakers tool that came out of some of the Civic Lab work. And each of those resources highlight that parking requirements are a significant barrier to building more housing. And one of the most effective ways that local governments can actually reduce the cost to producing housing is to reduce or remove parking requirements. So why is SACOG making that recommendation? Well, there are 4 big reasons I just wanted to highlight today. The first is that parking requirements make housing less affordable, full stop. Building a parking space is incredibly expensive. Of course, that expense isn't just eaten by the developer, it gets passed on to the buyer or the tenant. For each parking space that you add to a project, the average price goes up 15 to 30% per unit, just from the parking. We know from rental rates that each additional parking space adds about $225 on average a month to rent. And the second reason is that they take up a lot of space. The average parking space takes up upwards of 300 square feet. It's not much smaller than a studio apartment building, or a unit, I should say. And so that's just a tremendous amount of space, right? And there's this inherent trade-off between car storage and the thing that you're actually parking for. Onus parking requirements reduce the number of housing units that can be built on a typical parcel by about 15 to 25%. So it's not just that they're making the units more expensive, but it's also reducing how much we're building. And that means less housing where the demand is, which increases housing prices regionally, pushes people further away from their jobs, from their services. Of course, that also has implications and makes it harder for us to hit our climate goals. And then the third reason is that parking requirements are static, but parking demand varies pretty dramatically based on a variety of factors: location, proximity to transit, household size, the income, the ethnicity of the people who live there. Unfortunately, we apply a one-size-fits-all approach to parking, even though developers are usually targeting different markets. Static parking requirements, they assume that all people have the exact same travel behavior, the exact same parking needs. And we know that lower income non-white households own a lot less cars than affluent white households. Most carless households across the nation in our region are lower income and non-white. So when we say that everyone has to pay for 2 parking spots as a part of their housing costs, it's disproportionately penalizing lower income and non-white households. And then the final point, I think maybe this is the most important one, is that removing parking requirements doesn't mean we won't have parking. It means that developers can tailor the amount of parking that they provide to the actual needs of their project. Just to use an analogy, maybe an imperfect one, but government doesn't regulate the amount of closet storage that must be built in every home, but it does regulate the number of spaces that we store cars. And I think it's based on this fear, I think, that sometimes developers would just all of a sudden forget to provide parking if government didn't tell them exactly how many spaces they need to provide. And I think in reality, we know that developers are very sophisticated. They have a extremely good sense of the market for their commodity, and they'll likely provide the right number based on the price points and the location of the project and all of the factors that we talked about before. So that's all I have for my presentation. I'm going to open it up for questions and discussion.
Great, thank you very much. And James, I know you and I have had a lot of discussion prior to this coming on. I don't know if you wanted to add any words here before we get into a discussion with the committee as well.
Thanks, Chair Sirgus. I think Dob set this up really well. I think we're we're very aware that this is a state requirement that would come down to us. At the same time, as you and I have talked about, Chair Sirgos, I think there are some things in terms of local policies that, as Dob just put in front of you, all the actions we've taken policy-wise, I think that are just very common sense to reduce the cost of housing. And I think this is exactly one of those. So we're really putting this in front of you today, looking for a good debate. Please ask questions or clarifying questions. I think there is a lot of misinformation. This does not ban the ability of local governments to have parking minimums off those transit corridors, and it does let the market decide even around the transit corridor. So, but looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, James. So, colleagues, any questions, comments on this bill? I will say, from my perspective, when I first saw the bill come out, I wasn't necessarily in favor. As it's moved along, I've sort of taken and had more discussions. I've had a different outlook on this. So we'll get into it. But I see Director Stollard has his hands up. So go ahead, Tom.
Well, to me, if you're a developer, you're going to put as much parking as you feel you need to have so that the places you're building are rentable. So I do not think government needs to expand upon that basic instinct of a developer. And if he doesn't do it right, or she doesn't do it right, it'll be disfavored. And that's the way the marketplace works. I mentioned this because the things that Dov just said could be applied to so many things in the Universal Building Code. I've just finished completing 7 apartments in a renovated historic building in Woodland. I cannot believe the tens of thousands of dollars I literally wasted on things that are required and inspectors insist on that had nothing to do with the usefulness of this building. And I was only able to avoid some really onerous ones because the building was under a prior building code. I can't even stay balanced talking about it. It's just astounding to me. And this is a layer that's outside of the realm of public policy. The Universal Building Code, the insurance industry requires you build to it, and the inspectors require you build according to it. And every time they come out with whoever these people are, wherever they are, they just keep laying on more cost. Now, I know we're not talking about those aspects of it, but if we're serious about housing, we're going to have to ask, why does housing have to be so expensive to build? Apartments these days cost the equivalent of single family homes. You could build 20 homes for what you build 20 apartments for. It's just outrageous. So I just feel like there's a lot to be done here. And, James talks about how SACOG could be doing more for us, in the region. If we really want to get serious about housing, we've got to start pushing back. We local electeds get blamed for so many things for the development community that we have no control over because this faceless, nameless group called the Universal Building Code people put so much in there. So I don't know how we deal with this, but honestly, I'm ready to literally get government off the backs of the development community because I don't think we're solving that many problems. Here's another couple examples. We now have to sprinkle every building. It's a laudable goal. I support that, but you can't sprinkle a house without adding another $15,000 to the price of the house, more or less. And now we used to have the houses be solar ready, which I thought was very sensible because you could buy your house now and then you could add solar at any time, made it easy to do it. Now it has to have the solar at the front end. That is another $10,000 to $15,000 probably, if not more. So, every time you add $1,000 to the value of the house, you just scrape away a certain segment of the public that can't afford to qualify for a loan. So it just disturbs me that government, in its attempt to do great stuff, has made building housing so expensive and so difficult. That's my speech for today, guys. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. And I agree. I mean, I had my in-laws have a manufactured home that was built in Orange County in the back in Villa Park. And it needed a certain type of water heater, even though a normal water heater right off, the floor from Home Depot, for $300, $400 would have done just a great job, but you had to have a certain one that was only in Riverside, that was $1,500, that was mandated under the UBC, which made no sense. You know, if you were in a trailer traveling around the country, that might make sense, but considering that where this one was at, made zero sense at all. Director Gog. Oh, you're still muted.
Yes, what Tom said makes a lot of sense. You know, we make builders put in sprinkler systems in the house, and then we do the solar panels and a bunch of other things, you know, certain type of water heater and everything. All that does is take affordability away from people that want to buy a house. It jacks up the price $15,000, $30,000, $40,000. And a lot of these things, we don't really know how they're going to come out in the long run, because when you put solars on, you got to have a maintenance done to them. And not a lot of people are going to have the maintenance done, and solar's not going to work at 100% efficiency if they got a ton of dirt on, especially if you live in a community like I do, you know, farm community. And all these things are new, but they, without any kind of facts on all these things, they're making us do all these things. I think that we need to build some simple houses where people can cover their head and keep them affordable. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Gog. Director Thomas.
Good morning. Sorry I was late. My other appointment ran late. Tom, great comments. You're just right on. And so my question to all of us is, what can we do to help move the needle on that? You know, this, you don't often see government reducing regulations. And like you say, this bill is a step in the right direction. That I like the idea that, you know, the market can drive implementation, which is where it often, you know, works best. So what can SACOG do? And what can we all do to help move the needle on this, reducing government regulations? And is there some low hanging fruit that we can impact?
Good question, Director Thomas. And I would agree. I mean, and it's unusual just to see, you know, I think a body saying, yeah, let's give up some control. But really what we're saying is, let's build some more housing. Let's get out of the market's way with things that aren't, you know, necessarily in the best interest of expanding that or in other areas as well. So I would be interested to see what else we could do as a body to, you know, move along this conversation, not just on 1401, but potentially on other barriers that we see as we move forward. I think it's a good free market approach that nicely intersects with some very current needs that we have as well. I'm going to put one commissioner on director on the spot, only because out of everyone that's spoken so far, you know, it doesn't, and this bill doesn't necessarily affect our jurisdictions as much the way it's currently laid out. But I was wondering, Director Middleton, if you had any comments. I know Citrus Heights, I think it's touched by this a little bit in terms of this legislation. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts or concerns with the legislation.
I am really excited that we're actually considering supporting this, simply because Citrus Heights is an infill community, and when we're talking about minimum parking spaces, it really turns developers off because you just can't make it work, right? And it also, in my mind, helps us to navigate a little bit away from more traditional modes of transportation like single family cars, and really start to help us to rely on more public transportation, alternative means of transportation, which is something that our city is really interested in doing. So for me, it checks a lot of boxes, so I like it.
Great, that's good. And I really want to thank you, and I appreciate those comments, because it's easier for me to say as, well, it'll have little to no, impact on mine, except for maybe, future planning down the road. But, for those jurisdictions that were going to have a direct impact, I wanted to hear what you all have to say on it. So thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, any other comments?
I'm actually going to show you a picture of a stairwell I had to build on this building. It required engineering of 5 sheets at $9,600 just for the engineering. I estimate I spent $100,000 on this exterior stairwell. It's not the first building I've done where I had to add an exterior stairwell. There was no engineer involved. The architect designed it. the contractor built it. I probably built that staircase for less than 10,000. So, I mean, that's an example of the dramatic escalation of costs due to the regulations. I've been building buildings since 1980, and every one of them is a order of magnitude greater in terms of cost because of the increasing regulations. You would think after all these years, we would have figured this out and figured out some way to drive costs lower, but all we keep doing is driving costs higher. So I appreciate what Wendy said. I'm surprised that there's not some organized effort to do this at the state level, but they keep adding to the problem rather than helping us solve it.
Chair Saragosa, can I
Yes.
just weigh in and make a comment? Director Thomas, I hear what you're saying, and I think, you know, one of the well, in terms of this committee and the policy agenda, again, great news. We got Green Means Go funding. That was really where we focused, as you know, a lot of our time and our lobbyist time, and we didn't pull off the whole 100 million, but we got 34, and we have a new statewide program as a result. So there's really important questions for this committee and for us as staff about where we go from here, and you'll have chances to weigh in on that for 2022, right? Do we keep on going and try to keep supporting that? Are there other policy you know, tracks and priorities that we want to take on and sort of spread a little bit of our efforts? But just back to your point, we have entertained in the past this idea of, I think it's sometimes very hard for this state and this legislature to think about either doing a program entirely statewide or relieving a regulation entirely statewide. And because we're so unique and so different at all of our regions, you know, we have discussed a sort of, you know, an innovation bill that would, or an effort. Some of these things, as Tom is saying, or Director Stahl is saying, goes, they may not be in legislation. They actually may be in other, you know, binders of codes and UBCs and regulations. But there's a concept that I really like, which is around trying to get some kind of pilots to begin, maybe in different regions, including ours, that can test. You know, what if we gave some flexibility? What if we removed a few things? What would it take to, I don't want to suggest that that is an easy thing or that we will win in 12 months. And my joke on Green Means Go is that, you know, we took the hardest thing on first rather than small victories. But I just want to say, I think what you are saying, Director Thomas, and I know you've got some sentiments here from other board members, is something we have discussed, and it's timely. You know, given our discussions now about kind of where we go from here for the next calendar year for our policy priorities.
Thank you, James. Director Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, James. Really appreciate that. And I think what's frustrating to all of us is that it seems like the state's answer to making housing affordable is to force all of our jurisdictions to come up with incentives to, you know, help facilitate this. And it's going to require all of us to do our part. As I know, as El Dorado County is working on infill ordinances and affordable housing ordinances, you know, and looking at ways we can move the needle, I think we also need to push pretty hard on the state to continue helping us at a local level meet our local needs and our local market, rather than necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach, which often doesn't work real well in California. You're completely right, James. But I like your idea of pilot projects in regions that can help meet our affordable housing goals while letting local markets have a little more flexibility in how we do that. So appreciate the conversation this morning.
Thank you, Wendy. I agree. I mean, you know, talking about it just not being legislation, or, I mean, you have the Building Standards Commission, which is really the lead agency on a lot of this, which is a cottage industry unto itself. Between the NFPA and the I-codes and a lot of the things. I only know this because I had the Building Standards Commission under me when I was in the Schwarzenegger administration. And so you have a lot of institutionalized stuff there that goes into all these codes and conditions that we have to meet when we build things. and it's very much protected by certain interests. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, I think, across the state. As we go forward, I'd love to be able to have a larger conversation on this topic as we go forward, because it does intersect exactly with what we're trying to do in terms of more housing, better traffic movement, and how we get there with all these other regulations that are piled upon us, that Director Thomas also said doesn't always work when you're in a rural community or even necessarily in an urban one where you're trying to make all these things hit a certain standard. So James, I don't know where we, somewhere we can talk more about this, but how we maybe have a lane to continue this discussion into the future. For now, if there's not any other questions on this bill, I would entertain a motion.
I move we support the bill.
Second.
All right. Thank you, Director Middleton. We have a first and a second. Do we have any public comments on this item?
No public comment.
Okay. So with that, then we will go to a roll call vote.
All right, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi. Director Bernasconi, please indicate your vote. Absent. Director Burris. Absent. Frericks. Absent. Director Gog.
Yes.
Director Lozano.
Aye.
Middleton.
Aye.
Stollard.
Aye.
Thomas.
Aye.
Vice Chair Kozlowski. Absent. And Chair Saragosa.
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right.
Mr. Chair, let's also ask our staff to be thinking of ways that we can address housing affordability beyond just supporting bills. Okay.
I agree with
I'd
that.
like to come back on that.
Thank you, Director Stoller. I agree. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We're going to go ahead now then and move to our information portion of our agenda and into item 3, which is our communication with our auditors and our auditing standards. And Ms. Sue has this for us this morning.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. SACOG, as a MPO who receive federal and state fundings, as such, we are required to undergo a financial audit by independent auditors each fiscal year. As required by auditing standards number 114, the auditors are required to communicate certain matters related to the audit to the charge of the governance of the agency. And for SACOG, it is the Policy and Innovation Committees. I'm going to be turning it over to Mr. David Showalter. He is the partner with Bailey, who is our financial auditors. He's going to go over the planned scope and the timing of the audit, and also the year-end field work and then also the audit approach for this year audit for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2021.
All right. Thank you, Loretta. Good morning, David.
Good morning, directors and members of the committee, and thank you for having me this morning to present our planning communication with respect to the June 30th, 2021 audit. And I can share my screen real quick here and go through the presentation. So as I indicated, my name is David Showalter with Bailey, and I'm the audit partner responsible for the audit engagement. And Christina Ransom is our senior manager. She'll be responsible for the day-to-day audit of SACOG this year. We do have another partner, Kanali Sukasim, who will also be involved as a technical partner. And then we have Selena Lee, who will be the in-charge auditor, senior auditor. So our audit scope is the audit of the annual comprehensive financial report for SACOG, as well as the single audit. The single audit is the audit of your federal programs. We'll also assist with the preparation of the financial statements and with respect to the LTF and the STA funds, we're going to make reference to the other auditors who are auditing those funds as part of our audit. And so our responsibility, just as a reminder, that we're responsible for auditing your financial statements to ensure that they're fairly stated in all material respects in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. Our opinion provides a reasonable but not an absolute assurance that the financial statements are free of material misstatement. And our audit does not relieve management of its responsibilities for the financial statements. So simply the financial statements are management's responsibility. They're essentially prepared by management. They take responsibility for those financial statements, and our responsibility is to come in and audit those financial statements to ensure that they're fairly stated. We also perform a single audit of your federal programs, where we'll also express an opinion as to whether SACOG is in compliance with the laws and regulations with respect to those federal programs. And then our responsibility also includes planning the audit. So that's where we're in that process now of planning the audit to identify where those risks are with respect to material non-compliance and material misstatements with respect to the financial statements. So that includes obtaining an understanding of the organization, updating our understanding, any new risks or any other events or things that might affect SACOG and its financial statements, in order for us to plan our audit procedures in order to identify and detect those material misstatements in the financial statements. That includes looking at internal controls, looking at processes and procedures, so that at the conclusion of the audit, if there were any issues that did come up, we would communicate those to you in our audit. And at the conclusion of our audit, we'll communicate to you in a separate letter the qualitative aspects of accounting policies, any changes in those accounting policies, any difficulties encountered in the audit, any corrected and uncorrected misstatements, any disagreements we have with management, and whether management consulted with any other accountants with respect to the audit. So that'll be a separate letter that we'll present to you at the conclusion of the audit. From a timeline perspective, we're starting the planning and the interim phase of the fieldwork in August this month. And then we will be back out in September to do the final phase of the audit with the hope of issuing the report sometime in that November timeframe. Just a high level, what our approach is with respect to the audit. As we come in and we do the audit each year, we definitely want to get an understanding of what has changed from the prior year. And so, it's been about 6 months or so since we've finished the audit for 2020, and a lot can change in that 6-month time before we come back out and start planning for the next year's audit. So it's really important that we meet with management, get a good understanding of any changes that have occurred within the organization, whether there's been any turnover within the organization, whether there's been any certain additional risks or new programs with respect to areas that we need to focus on in the audit. We don't look at the audit as, okay, we just carry forward what we did in the prior year and let's do it again. We really want to make sure that each year's audit is, stands on its own. And, with respect to COVID-19, of course, there's been a lot of changes with procedures and internal controls and how we go about doing business, especially for a government agency. A lot of our government agencies are still working from home. They're doing a lot of the administrative aspect of their programs remotely. So that does create an environment where there could be a deficiency in internal controls. There could be shortcuts that are put into place in order to get things more streamlined. Could be limitations with respect to accounting systems that maybe they don't offer a robust workflow. So those types of things are a challenge for a lot of our government agencies. So, one of the things is we kind of look into, SACOG implementing a newer system recently, and, taking a look at that to make sure that from a perspective of segregation of duties and internal controls, things appear to be working as they should be in that area. Tone at the top is really important for us. So part of our audit planning is to meet with those charged with governance, is what we're doing today, as well as meeting with the executive team, just to make sure that we have an understanding of any new changes that have occurred during the year, We also get an understanding of any fraud risks or areas of fraud that could have occurred during the year, so that we're aware of that. So that's all part of our understanding of the entity as well. And then we get into the details of the audit, taking a look at those key business cycles, revenue disbursements, payroll, everything that has an impact on the financial statements. We're looking at those controls and those systems. Part of our audit is just to make management aware of where we are with the audit. So we have periodic status meetings to keep management aware of our progress through the audit. We have been able to conduct the audit remotely pretty successfully over this last year. So we'll continue to do that into the foreseeable future. We're also planning the single audit, preliminary planning. So we'll start planning what those programs are going to be and start to do some preliminary risk assessment over that. Any questions on our approach? Within the approach, there is some unpredictability that we do build into our audit. So there will be some areas of the audit that we'll take a look at for the first time this year that we haven't maybe looked at in the past. So we're still working through that process of determining what we may look at a little more closely. But sometimes it could be just looking at journal entries more closely to see who's approving journal entries and what are those journal entries for. As well as looking at maybe some specific policies that might, something we may haven't looked at in the past. So for this year's audit, there are a couple of accounting standards that are going to be effective. Government Accounting Standards 84 deals with fiduciary activities. So maybe not so much of an impact for SACOG, although we are looking at certain things just to make sure that SACOG does have policies with respect to the LTF and the STA funds, making sure that they are essentially, required to be reported in special revenue funds. That's where they're recorded now. But with respect to all the activities of SACOG, we want to make sure that if there's anything that looks like it needs to be in a fiduciary fund, then we would make sure that that gets reported in accordance with the GASB 84. So GASB 84 is essentially just redefining what a fiduciary fund is. That would be your pension trust funds, your investment trust funds, and your custodial, your agency funds. SACOG currently doesn't have any of those types of funds right now, but some of you come from larger organizations that do have those types of funds. So probably won't have much of an impact on SACOG's financial statements, but something we will be looking at for this year's audit. The next standard deals with majority equity interests. Again, SACOG does not have or own any equity interests in other organizations, so it's not going to have much of an impact. Looking ahead, the major standard that has a pretty big impact on I would say all government agencies is GASB 87, dealing with leases. So this is effectively going to take all of your operating leases that you currently have and place them on the balance sheet as liabilities. So that's a major change for government. Most governments are quite invested in operating leases for space rent and other types of equipment and vehicles. So this is going to be effective starting with next year's audit, 2022. And the effective period is beginning in July 1st of 2021. So it's actually effective today, but it's going to be implemented for next year's audit. So this is something that we'll be working with SACOG on, just reviewing all of their operating leases to make sure that we have, they have a full catalog and an inventory of all their leases. They'll have to calculate each lease like a loan. There'll be an amortization schedule for each lease. There'll be an interest rate imputed for each lease, and each of those leases would be placed on the balance sheet as a liability with a corresponding right to use asset. So I feel like that's a pretty large and complicated standard for a lot of our government agencies to get their hands around. So we're definitely kind of stepping in and helping our clients navigate through that implementation.
I'm going to interrupt you just to say, this is just another example of expanding regulations that expand the time required to do the job, expand the cost to everybody. Right. And at the end of the day, I don't know how important it is for this agency. Right. Everybody has to do it, right?
That's right. Everybody has to do it. The rest of the accounting standards that are going to be effective in the future may or may not have much of an impact on SACOG. The only other one would be GASB 96, which again kind of ties into the lease accounting standard. for equipment and real estate and other types of items. This is going to deal with the subscription-based technology arrangements. So if you're renting the use of another company's accounting system, which is very common these days now, and you're renting the use of their storage space, like an Amazon, you'll now need to record that obligation on the balance sheet, and that'll be effective starting in 2023. So there's one more year before that implementation occurs. So essentially the GASB is really, the push for the GASB is really, we need to get all the obligations of the government agency on the balance sheet. And so this has been a very long phased in approach, starting with your pensions. And now it's translating into the leases. And so essentially it's just really demonstrating what is the full cost of government to the taxpayer or to the citizens. So that concludes the presentation, and we really appreciate this opportunity to present to you, and I'm really looking forward to working with you and your team this year on this year's audit. And we're hopeful that we'll have a very successful audit, and look forward to presenting to you at the conclusion.
All right. Thank you, David. And thank you, Loretta. Do we have, before we go into any question or comments from committee members, do we have any public comments on this one?
No public comment.
All right. So we'll bring it back to the committee. Any comments beyond Tom's very precise comments on maybe a potentially something that's not quite needed in the same way as maybe some of our cities do in counties? All right, we'll see none. Again, thank you, David, and we'll look forward to the report's findings later in the year. Thank you. All right. So we will go ahead and keep moving along here into item 4, which is our Innovative Mobility Program Framework. And Ms. Moretz has this presentation this morning.
Good morning, committee members. Adrienne Moretz, your SACOG staff. Give me one moment. I'm going to share my screen. So we are bringing forward today to you the Innovative Mobility Program's new framework. It's a 2-year framework. And we are bringing this forward because this program supports direct grants and programs for member jurisdictions and lots of partners. So all of this is in an effort to reduce car trips and to get us closer to our greenhouse gas reduction targets that are laid out in our long range transportation land use plan, the MTP-SCS. So the funding for this program was approved last September as part of SACOG's regional funding round. So today I'll be focusing on our new framework, which is your attachment B, and I'll go through that in detail in just a bit. So it is true, you know, when you think innovation or innovative mobility, you can think of the shiny new technology like autonomous vehicles. We launched some of those at Sac State and in the city of Rancho Cordova. But you can also think of tools and services and programs like the on-demand microtransit service that is getting community members to their doctor's appointments in Knights Landing. Or you can think of riding your bike to get ice cream in Old Town Folsom with your kids on May is Bike Month. And at the same time of these specific projects, you know, we really have to realize that travel is not typical right now. Travel patterns changed and we're in this disruptive period with our travel behavior. And so how do we innovate on those existing services to accommodate for that? So since this program is pretty broad and innovation can mean lots of different things, where we like to live, if you will, is the intersection of our existing infrastructure, our new technologies and partners, and market and social forces. So where the orange circle existing infrastructure means our roads and bridges that exist already, it also means our existing transportation network and existing transportation systems like public transit. And new technology does, of course, mean autonomous shuttles. It does mean electric bikes and car share, but it also means our research partners, universities, utilities, property owners, lots of different partners that we are interacting and collaborating with. And market and social forces is something new that we have added to this Venn diagram of sorts since we created this in 2019. And that's really due to the events over the past year and a half. But this program really does adapt to changing state and federal policy and state and federal initiatives that come down to us. It really is defined by the current state of our region. For example, we launched a telework pilot in the middle of the pandemic, and it really does incorporate the work of our Race, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group that's dedicating dollars for projects in underserved communities. So you'll see that later in the framework with the Engage, Empower, and Implement program. And market and social forces, can really help through this program ensure that communities are not left behind when technology services in the market really doesn't reach all types of communities, like low-income areas. So why do we do this? Well, first and most importantly, this is a strategy for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. It's a strategy in our MTP-SCS, our long-range plan, to meet that goal that we have. This program really lives in two big kind of policy areas to increase transit, walking and biking, and to shorten vehicle trips. So this program is directly responsible for 1 to 2% of our 19% greenhouse gas reduction target. You'll learn lots more about this reduction target as we continue to talk about MTP-SCS, especially over the upcoming months. But this program is also a strategy that's listed in our region's economic prosperity plan. And of course, people really do like to bike and walk and experience their community outside of their car, right? So there are specific strategies trying to meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets, but also serving our community members who really do like to test out new technologies and walk around in their communities. So before we jump into the framework, just a short timeline of where we've been. This program has been funded by SACOG for over 2 decades. It's really in the past 5 or 6 years that we have really transformed the program. So we did a strategic planning effort in 2015. And since then, we have shifted much more to performance-based programming. We've incorporated a lot more pilot projects, so shorter term projects that are at a lower cost, so we get learnings faster. We have incorporated innovation and tested and tweaked lots of different things with our programs and projects. And we have included lots more opportunities for competitive funding for our member jurisdictions and new and different partners. So that really kind of brings us to what you see on your screen. So at the bottom left, this program was adopted in 2020. September 2020 is when the board took action and adopted the SACOG regional funding round. And in that was a $6 million dedication to the Innovative Mobility Program over 2 years. So $3 million in 1 year and $3 million in the second year. So a total of $6 million. So in that gap in between September 2020 and now, we have continued programming set forth in our existing framework, as well as adapting to those market and social forces I was talking about. So we launched a regional telework pilot. We'll be talking about that in the next item and again in September. We expanded our guaranteed ride home program to ensure people do have rides home from their job. If their transit isn't able to get them there, people have to work late and they can't meet their van pool, for example. We have been developing a performance measurement template, and we've conducted now 2 virtual May is Bike Month campaigns. So we've continued a lot of work over this time while we've been developing this new framework. We have been getting feedback, not just from stakeholders, our member jurisdictions and partners, but also from internal teams at SACOG and peer reviewers across the country. And then after we start discussing this framework today, we'll start the implementation, which really leads us to the here and now. So, why are we bringing this new framework to you? What does that mean? Really, the goal and mission of our work here is increase the transportation options that are available to our communities and reduce vehicle miles traveled. We try to bring cutting edge programming that really does utilize our existing infrastructure. And we have some ambitious goals this time around. So of course we are trying to reduce vehicle miles traveled. We can't hit that home enough, meet those goals of our MTP-SCS. but also, leverage new partners, new technology, things that are coming up almost daily, new types of programs and services, and really to increase access to our existing services like our existing transit system, micromobility like scooters and electric bike share, shared mobility like car share. So really combining those three circles in that Venn diagram. Of course, trying to inform our next MTP. Like I mentioned, you'll start hearing more and more about how we're planning for the next 4 years and meeting that greenhouse gas reduction target over the course of updating our MTP. And finally, really want to support policies that increase access and benefit our underserved communities. So how do we do this? At a high level, this program is about 50%, a little over, of competitive grant opportunities and direct funding to our member jurisdictions of partners. And the other 50% is projects and programs. So I will go into each of these strategies in detail, but I do want to mention, this is a little bit different than a typical funding round program. It's not one grant opportunity. So we're not just bringing to you some guidelines that we want you to adopt. This program is a series of projects and programs. So this really isn't the last time you get to see this work. It's basically the first. So as we launch and develop each of these strategies that I'll be talking about and the projects within, we're going to continue to come to you, this committee as the lead, for feedback, for review, for action if necessary. And that's on things like the program design, partnerships, consultants, and of course, grant guidelines when appropriate. So the structure of your attachment B, which are laid out in tables, they're broken out by 4 different strategies, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then underneath that is a table. So starting from the left-hand side of the table, we have the program or project, and then a quick overview, a sentence or so about what that means and what we would do. And then examples of what projects could come out of that work. It's not a guarantee. These are just some illustrative examples that will likely adapt, evolve over time, but some examples. And then starting with a budget, we have our estimated budget over the next 2 years, totaling $6 million over these 4 strategies, match if appropriate. So if we're getting outside funding or other funding from within SACOG, and then an estimated timeline. So starting with strategy 1. This is where we can implement SACOG's priority projects using our Civic Lab platform. So Civic Lab is our way to launch projects by addressing challenges first, and then exploring opportunities and developing pilots that take into consideration the needs of the actual users of the system. So Civic Lab has looked like a 10-month intensive program with monthly workshops and homework. Director Thomas has participated in that round. It's also looked like a 4-part virtual housing series. So it's looked like many different things since 2018. So how we apply the Civic Lab process will really vary and may look different, but we want to use that accelerator process and really getting to the design for the user of the system to implement some of the priority plans and projects and efforts that we have underway at SACOG. A good first example is the Next Generation Transit Planning Study. This has kind of been over a year-long effort with our transit agencies and other partners to understand what do we do next and how do we best utilize our existing infrastructure for public transit and how do we continue to evolve and adapt on that program. So this program is a perfect place to step in and help implement projects from that, because we live in this space of pilot testing where we can support projects in the short term for a lower cost and get learnings quickly. We also have started to have conversations with transit agencies, with our internal team at SACOG. So how do we take the short-term strategies from the Next Generation Transit Planning Study and turn those into actual projects? Also in this strategy 1 is our Engage, Empower, Implement program that was also dedicated funding in our 2020 SACOG funding round. Another place where we can step in and implement projects that fit within the purview of innovative mobility, especially focusing on underserved communities. So in the timeline, Engage, Empower, Implement is a little bit behind. They're still developing and have not even started to develop this program. So that gives us a chance to start with next generation transit and get some projects on the ground with that, while Engage, Empower, Implement is being developed. So in strategy 2, very closely related, this is our pipeline, if you will. So this is about teeing ourselves up to be ready to implement as our funded plans and programs are ready. So an example is the pricing pilot grant. That is a grant we received from Caltrans to try to understand how our pricing system affects how we drive as individual drivers. And the grant we received is to set up a framework for a pilot test, but it's not the actual pilot itself. And so this program, again, can step in. Same with the Trails Plan you've been hearing a lot about over the course of the year. As we can potentially build out outreach or support for trails that exist or new trails that are coming online in our region, this program can support that. So where strategy 1 is implementing what we have ready now, strategy 2 is about teeing ourselves up. Strategy 3 is all about getting money to jurisdictions and partners through grants and other efforts. Regional challenge grants, it's our way of providing flexible grant opportunities to our jurisdictions. We have not decided what the focus areas are for this grant yet, but we will start working with your staff members and other partners this fall and winter. And the personalized trips campaign, also in strategy 3, is really our way to kind of maximize the existing tools we have at SACOG and then provide personalized information for travelers and incentivize them for using efficient modes like walking, biking, taking transit, or teleworking. And then finally, strategy 4 is all about our core programming. These are our tried and true reducers of vehicle miles traveled. So it includes things like reporting our van pools to the National Transit Database to get funding flowing back to us in the region. It includes the next iteration of our telework pilot, and it includes measuring the performance and outcomes of our work, which we've gotten much stronger at, but we want to continue to build that up. So with all of this, we have been talking to your jurisdictions, we've been talking to other partners and stakeholders, and we've gotten some interesting feedback. First, a lot of ideas, which is exciting. So your jurisdictions, your staff, and other partners are really interested in how they fit into this program, where we might be able to get funding in this program to support some of the work that you have on the ground or are teeing yourselves up for. Everything from fare-free transit to just traveler information, to electric car share expansion, to electric bike subsidies, to microtransit, of course. So lots of excitement and ideas from what we've heard so far. We're also seeking peer review from experts from around the country. So Contra Costa Transportation Authority and MTC, so kind of our sister agencies close by, but also LA Metro, Central Texas Transit Authority, some agencies on the East Coast are all interested in giving us feedback on our program because we don't want to build this in a silo. So again, just reiterating, this is really the first time we'll be coming to you. As we'll build out each of these projects and programs, we'll continue to come back to this and other committees for feedback or action when necessary. So with that, I will pause for questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Adrienne. A lot of information to unpack. So thank you for getting everything in. Questions or comments from committee members? I do have a question. Do you have a sense of where you want to go with the regional challenge grants? You know, I'm like seeing maybe something, and not really for my, but like in the Folsom, El Dorado Hills area, where, you know, as that South Folsom gets, you know, further developed out, and just that whole sort of regional area there. But I'm just kind of wondering what at least the initial, I know you said you're still working through it, but what the initial thoughts were around those.
Yeah, that's a great question, Director. So we are trying to keep our eyes and ears open, right? We don't want to think we know the answer. It's our favorite thing to say. We don't know what we don't know. So that's why we really just want to let jurisdictions and partners guide us on what those focus areas are. Based on what we've heard so far is where a lot of those ideas kind of fit in. So on-demand or dynamic types of transportation services, of course, the smart rides and the Your Rides that YCTDA has, but also just other types of on-demand services. Heard a lot about electricity, I guess, if you will. So electric car share, electric bike subsidy. So how do we encourage people to use those types of services? We've also thought about outreach at the residential level. So traditionally, our programming has been focused on employer-based transportation and very much commute and not commute. And so we really need to expand that horizon and think more holistically about the way people travel. So absolutely, we're open to ideas. Again, likely in the fall is when we'll start having big open conversations, just like we did when the telework pilot started. We didn't want to dictate what we thought people needed help with. We wanted to just really listen and learn. And so we'll likely do something, a process very similar. And we'll bring that back to this committee, of course. So likely fall, winter is when we'll really start trying to hone in on what those kind of 3-4 focus areas might be.
Great. Thank you, Adrian. James, anything you want to add from a global perspective here?
No, I think Adrian did a great job, and if you were able to attend the luncheon on last Thursday, that was I think a great time for some of the board members and newer board members to dig in and ask a lot of questions. You know, as Adrian said, I think there's a number of opportunities that are coming up. I think it is always good, if this is truly innovative, it's always good to revisit this. So if you're wondering if you're a veteran, you know, I thought we looked at a framework a couple of years ago. You did, and we're taking those lessons and we're trying to apply them. And I think, as Adrian said, there's a number of synergies too right now. One in particular, which is the next generation transit study wrapping up. The board has actually put aside some of the discretionary funds there. We have a crisis in ridership and funding on the transit side. So we see that, among other things, as Adrian described, as a really good opportunity.
Thank you, James. And agree. I mean, I think I was telling Eric this last week was, you know, I every now and then I will take my our rapid transit down from Placerville into my office in Sacramento. And since COVID, I mean, they were usually fairly full. These were, you know, some of the few transit operations that were, you know, used a lot. And there was 2 of us on the trip down to Sacramento the entire way, you know, which usually had a pretty 30 people plus on these. So there is a crisis. I know Director Thomas, I'm sure has more on, you know, from El Dorado Transit. I'm not sure, Wendy, if you're on El Dorado on Transit Authority, but you know, no. Gotcha. So it's been I mean, there's a real crisis going on there, you know, with just the lack of use, and really, you know, the long-term outlook of, you know, how do we best use those? Is micro transit a better option in some cases? And also looking at these transit agencies having to go from you know, the fleets that they have today to an all electric fleet, you know, which is going to be a huge cost when they're suffering. So there's a lot of things going on in that spot as well. Okay, any other comments from directors?
Michael, I actually have a question.
Yes.
You stimulated a thought for me. This is Mike Kozlowski. And I'm not sure who to pose this question to, but if the number of people that are using transit, if the number of people that are traveling to work over a relatively long distance, right? So the Placerville to Sacramento trip, for instance, right? If the number of people that are doing that trip never rebounds, right, or never fully rebounds, right, then why would we expect the public transit version of that trip quantity to rebound differently? So how we puzzle, and that's sort of it's a question that I'm sure doesn't have an answer right this minute, but the question is if we had, 100 people making that trip and 30 of them used to use public transit, and now we have 10 people making that trip and 2 of them are using public transit, do we take the success on the vehicle miles traveled and congratulate ourselves, or do we flog ourselves over the long haul public transit not happening in the way that we would intellectually like it to happen? So, I mean, I feels like we can take a win, right? And then focus on microtransit so that the trips within the, within El Dorado County and within Sacramento are better serviced, right? But those long haul trips, maybe we'd never get them back. So I don't know, just those synapses stuck together there for a moment.
No, you're right though, Mike. And I don't know. I mean, the question I think is still out there is, will these rebound? I'm not sure. I mean, from friends that I have that work in state government in Sacramento, it's still very much up in the air as to what the new normal is going to look like. Now I think there was some people coming back, and then Delta variant, it sort of, further delayed.
Yeah, irrespective of the Delta variant, my place of work, I don't think will ever return to I mean, we were already drifting towards remote work anyway, and we basically just got to rip the Band-Aid off and switch, right? So I can't imagine myself ever wanting to have a cubicle in some office anywhere any longer for what I do, so it works fine for me to work from my living room as I'm doing right now.
Agreed. Okay, do we have any public comments?
No public comment.
All right, well, I guess to be continued really on this issue for everybody. I mean, certainly a lot of directors that have, like Director Thomas, that have been engaged on Civic Lab that can provide further input as we move down the road here on all these different items. So Adrian, again, thank you for this, and well, in fact, you'll be up next again, which sort of dovetails with a telework update as well. So with that, we'll move to item 5, which is our SACOG Regional Telework Pilot Initiative.
A great segue from the comments that happened in the last item. These two things tie very closely together. So I just briefly wanted to say, in terms of the telework pilot that we've been working on here at SACOG, in June, we came to you and said that we'd hope to have more information for you in August. What I wanted to bring forward today is just that we'll have a more comprehensive update for you in September, where we will be bringing back the big takeaways from this pilot, what you can expect to see in terms of resources for yourselves or for other employers that did not get a chance to participate, and really what the next steps are for our work in this region. I will say that we have had really active and engaging activity with our participating employers, even since we met with you last. So for example, Caltrans, which is one of our participating employers, is rolling out a telework pilot program division by division. It includes this flow chart for telework decision-making. Sacramento Air District just launched a tentative telework policy they plan to update at the beginning of next year. They just completed and concluded with us manager and employee focus groups to really still hone in on what's working and what's not in terms of telework. And CalSTRS, the state teachers retirement system, is engaging with the transportation arm of our consultant to get their commute and transportation plan ready for the new development that they have in West Sacramento. So they can make sure that they're encouraging efficient modes of transportation and understand how telework fits into that, a new development. So again, we'll be back to you in September. Just wanted to make sure we gave you this brief update. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Questions, comments?
I'd just like to say, I'm not sure we have to encourage people to telework. I think if anything, we're gonna have to encourage them to show up occasionally at the bricks and mortar. I think a lot of us are realizing the efficiency of this and the desirability and the freedom it has given us. I went to the point of yearning to return to in-person meetings to now rather being comfortable that I don't have to jump in my car, drive somewhere, park the darn thing to get to a meeting and then jump back in the car to race off to some other location. So I think, I think we don't even know what the new normal is. I think we're all kind of working that way. And then we have things that come along like resurgence of COVID. This technology, all I can say is thank God this technology was there at the time we really needed it. It's kept our world turning and working. So, but I think Mike Kozlowski made an amazingly important point earlier. I'm on the transit board. We're meeting tonight. By the way, we are going to a point-to-point system in Woodland and to take you also to the point of catching the intercity bus. We have one really successful line in normal times, the 42. It's the one that goes to downtown Sacramento, comes by the airport and goes around to Davis. And we run it clockwise and counterclockwise. We're by eliminating the local routes, we're going to be able to double the frequency of that route and then allow point to point. I just think, in other words, facts are, I always say facts tend to make decisions for us. In this case, facts are compelling us, and it's a good thing. And it's just the way the future sometimes unfolds. So, I rode my bike by our bus depot this morning, 90 buses sitting out there on the lot, CNG terminal. We have the electric charging for the electric buses, a lot of infrastructure, I think, and then how do you deal with paratransit? An entirely separate system under current organization. When you go to VIA, you can create vehicles that accommodate your paratransit needs as well. So I guess what I'm saying is I think we're being dragged into this new world, not because we wanted to go there, but maybe it's not so bad once we find ourselves having no other choice. So Adrian, you've got a big job.
It's true.
Certainly.
I mean, I do think there's a uniqueness to the downtown Sacramento area, because it's been such built out around state workers and city and county workers that, unlike other areas that maybe didn't suffer as much during the pandemic and really just maybe long-term from people telecommuting, there's definitely going to have to be, I think, a reimagining, if that's the case, when it comes to the Sacramento, at least that downtown Sacramento area, because everything is built around, the Capitol building here. It's like myself, I'm sitting in a building right now, 3-story building there's 4 people in this entire building, including myself. And it's been that way now for, almost 14, 15 months. I mean, we've come in because it's essentially like we have the whole place to ourselves, but it's really not. It's like, what do you do with this building long term if you're not going to be able to have the same type of office space? I mean, does it do you try to convert it to something else, and what are the cost benefits of that? So I think there's going to be a lot of questions as we move forward, and what buildings look like as we go, because I think Mike and everyone's right here. I mean, it is not going to be the same. I mean, people are going to be working from home much more so as we go forward, even after the pandemic.
Chair Saragosa, if I could, just to help you wrap this item, I just want to give a shout out to the staff. And if you all remember, it's hard to remember a year ago, but as we were trying to, and Adrian and her team were trying to do this kind of in-person mobility accelerator, it became very evident to us we were not going to be able to do this kind of Civic Lab accelerator the way they had done it before. And they pivoted very quickly. They've been doing this telework pilot program. You'll learn more about it. I do think, yes, we're being forced into this, as you all are saying, but I also think there's a lot more that we can do and help with in terms of being intentional, support a lot of our employers, private sector, state agencies to be intentional, to learn from each other, not run afoul of some of the HR things. And when we're not teleworking, trying to really continue to encourage, when we begin to reopen, a bit more broader, people to not drive alone. So anyway, just kudos to the staff for pivoting on this, and you'll hear more next month on the update.
Sounds,
Mr. Chair, if I may, one more comment. I feel that the freeway usage is getting back to close to what it was. I mean, when I'm on the freeway, it's amazing how many vehicles are out there now. So that's still a concern of ours. Vehicle miles traveled is still a concern, and if we have options that are attractive to people, which is, why we're doubling the number of 42 buses. We want people who need to go to take the bus if they can, and with parking more difficult in downtown Sacramento, we think we may have a useful option. In other words, we're not saying no to transit. It just has to be rethought.
Agreed. And hopefully some of those folks come back. I think there's still some hesitancy about jumping into public transportation, during the pandemic. So we may have actually increased some of our VMT because you're seeing individual drivers that might have otherwise taken a transit down. So I don't know if that's a big portion, but I do think there's a portion there. So maybe we'll see an uptick. That's what I'm assuming we'll see maybe a little bit, at least in El Dorado County, as sort of post-pandemic, whenever that may be.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, again, Adrian, thank you. And we'll look forward to the next update. Okay, we're going to move along to item 6, which is our Mega Region Working Group meeting and summary. And Clint has this presentation for us this morning. So thank you, Clint.
Good morning, everyone. So it's been a little while since we talked about the Mega Region. Right before our committees went on break, we had our last Mega Region meeting. That was the second meeting of this year on June 25th. And the focus of that meeting was to start identifying priority mega regional transportation investments. So the last time we talked about Mega Region at the policy committee, we brought through a framework that we developed with the Mega Region partners. That's MTC in the Bay Area, San Joaquin Council of Governments, and San Joaquin County. That would help us hone in on a short list of priority investments that we want to work to advance over the next 12 months to 5 years. And so we did that on the 25th. We came up with a list of about 12 capital projects, really focusing on mega regional connections. The purpose of this is that with our combined voices, we are much more capable of advancing our shared priorities and bringing attention to the investment needs that we have in the Northern California mega region. And this is a critical part of our strategy to both increase our competitiveness for federal funds when we're competing against other metropolitan areas around the country, but then also even within California when we're competing against Southern California for a lot of very precious transportation dollars. So the priorities really, they formed around primarily two different things. So highway connections, and that is a triangle of highways that connect the mega region. That's I-5, it's I-80 connecting us into the Bay Area and San Joaquin. And then from the Bay Area into the San Joaquin County, 205 was a major priority. The other, so those were the highway investments. The other major focus of these were interregional rail connections. So Capital Corridor, Valley Rail, and the Altamont Corridor Express. So in your packet, you have both the framework that help guide the identification of these projects. You also have a more detailed listing of all 12 of the capital projects that were put forward. In the Sacramento region, those included I-80 managed lanes, so all the way from the Solano County line into the I-80 US 50 interchange, looking at ITS improvements, bicycle and pedestrian improvements, and then really importantly, tied to both our regional plan and the Bay Area's regional plan is this managed lane component. So we've talked a lot about pricing and it being a critical part of both funding our transportation system, but also making sure that we're able to manage demand on our facilities to help us achieve greenhouse gas reduction targets, clean air, but also give people a more reliable trip. So the I-80 managed lanes project, that includes the causeway. That has been a bottleneck we've seen in our region for quite some time. The other is I-5 managed lanes. So from Sacramento extending south, looking at managed lanes there. And those were the two SACOG highway focused projects. And then on the rail side, extending the Altamont Corridor Express out of San Joaquin County up into Sacramento through Elk Grove into Natomas, and then all the way to the Sacramento International Airport. And bringing that project with a number of stations all the way up into Sacramento. And then the second rail project was the Capitol Corridor third track connecting into Roseville. That would take us from 1 trip a day up to the ability to have 10 round trips daily. So those are the 4 Sacramento projects. One thing we acknowledge as a mega region is we can't just focus on the projects that we have approaching shovel readiness now. We've got to start looking at the next phase of projects that are going to need studying, environmental, right-of-way, all of the work that you need to do in advance of going and asking for capital dollars. So you'll also see in the list a concept for a freight infrastructure study, a freight electric freight readiness infrastructure study that would look at I-5, at 99 and I-80 and look for opportunities to bring heavy duty charging that would help facilitate some of the transition in freight vehicles to electric. And right now we do not have enough of the really heavy duty chargers, both for our transit fleets, but also freight fleets. And those are limiting factors when major freight operators are looking at potential for transition. So conducting a feasibility analysis in partnership with the mega region partners to start looking at where we would site those things and what other requirements are needed would be one of those things we'd be looking to do in the next 12 months. So our next meeting is in September, and where we're taking this list of projects between now and that next meeting in September is to really identify a plan of action for what funds we'd be going after, how we want to start bringing these projects up and elevating them to the attention of the state and the federal governments. With SB1 rounds coming up, these projects could be in line for very competitive asks in future SB1 funding. But there's also other funding sources that we want to explore as part of identifying a reliable funding package for these investments. So that's where we're at. The next meeting will be in September. Hopefully we'll have more of a plan of action for all of these projects. And then we would be working with the partners over the course of the next 6 months to a year to advance those for funding, or at least partial parts of their funding. So with that, I will stop. I'm also joined here by Sam Shelton. He helped pull together the list on the SACOG side of transportation investments. So any more detailed questions on the projects that we put forward, Sam can probably help us answer those as well. And then I think Director Kozlowski and James, if you had anything to add from that last meeting, you were also there with us. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Clint. Yeah, Mike or James, if you wanted to add anything.
Just one quick thing. First of all, Clint, excellent summary of probably almost 3 hours of discussions that day. I think the thing that stood out for me was that last point that you landed on, which is the long-term need to work together to sort out what the charging infrastructure needs to be like for heavy vehicles to switch to electric, because that's something that we may have a goal of having that in place in 15 or 20 years even, and that's not a lot of time in the grand scheme of things, and we need to get going on it. So I think that's a critical piece of this infrastructure that doesn't exist and is complicated to put in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Two quick things, and a powerful testament to the influence of this short list of projects. Congratulations to everybody involved in the Yolo Causeway for winning one of our biggest national grants that we've won in this region for quite some time, the infra grant to the tune of 86 million. Major investment, major mega regional priority. So again, congrats to that, coming just days after this work, but also as maybe a segue to your next agenda item. Also, a pretty big program in the federal infrastructure bill moving through the Senate right now is around mega region projects. So the timing is very good on these.
Thank you, James. Any other comments? had a question on the causeway and the managed lanes. How far out are we from something like that actually coming into fruition?
Might ask if Sam, are you here and available? I think you've got a better grasp than I do on next steps for the causeway project.
Yes, for the Yellow 80 project.
Yeah.
Should they secure enough funding to close the funding gap of about $40 million, they could start construction in 2025. As far as alternatives that consider other styles of managed lane beyond HOV lanes, they'll continue to study those alternatives in the project approval and environmental document stage that they're in for the project.
Thank you.
But
And
they will likely require more funding and additional studies for those, as well as connections to I-80 North.
Understood. And Sam, are those dollars, could those come out of SB1 dollars, or is that a different pot where they'd have to get that funding?
I believe they have multiple fund sources they're targeting, including the Solutions for Congested Corridors grant through SB1, as well as our own fund sources here at SACOG, or discretionary funds.
Understood. Thank you. Any other questions? Do we have any public comments?
No public comment.
Okay, well, we'll look for the next update here, and certainly if there's anything, Mike and James, if there's anything that any extra information we can provide or input prior to, let us know as well. Happy to give our thoughts, as anything else that might pop up along the way as we kind of crystallize what the asks are. Okay, thank you, Mr. Holtzen, and that will segue us into our last information item, which is our advocacy update. And Sabrina is leading us this morning on this update. So thank you, Sabrina.
Yes, good morning, committee members. Sabrina Bradbury, your SACOG staff. I have our federal lobbyists here, Devin Barnhart and Jason Pavlicek. So I'm going to turn it over to them to give the federal update first, and then I'll dive into the state update.
Great. Good morning or good afternoon, your time.
Yep, we're out west or out east. Sorry. Can I share my screen? Sabrina, could I get you to take that one down? Thank you. Well, we are in a super exciting time in the world. It's not often that we get to report good news from the federal government, but things are happening in Washington, D.C. So let me just get this into viewing mode. All right, so just as a reminder, we're your federal lobbyists, Devin and Jason, and we've been doing transportation and infrastructure for a number of years, and really focus on anything that SACOG is working on, but we focus on it in Washington, D.C. To give you a sense of sort of where we've come from the last time we met with you all, last time President Biden had introduced a gigantic infrastructure proposal, and he had just started talking to the Republicans about could we get a deal. That deal went up and down like a roller coaster as it came together, then didn't come together. And then finally, a group of bipartisan senators, there was 20 of them at the start, 10 core bipartisan group that was able to negotiate an agreed upon package with President Biden. And in an exciting news, they have spent the better part of the last month getting that deal together. And excitingly, today, that package is just about to make its way through the Senate, either today or tomorrow is probably more likely, and will actually pass. There was a lot of, every 3 days, people were saying that bill wasn't going to go anywhere, but it is very exciting that we've made it this far and that this level of federal funding could be on its way to help support communities and states. A couple of cautionary notes as we go through the rest of the presentation. This bill is gigantic. It's 2,700 pages. It is a surface transportation reauth. It is a huge appropriations bill. It's similar in scope to ARA in terms of just like sheer size of the various programs. And so there is a lot to unpack. We are not doing that all here today. This is a high level overview of what's in the bill. It's also not going to pass tomorrow, so there's plenty of time to sort of keep digging into the details as we go forward. A couple of things to think about when we're going through some of the programs and some of the funding levels is really just to give you a sense of like what will be coming down the pipeline as this bill moves to becoming law. And so this is really meant to start that process. It also is a little bit still in flux. It's mostly done. It's like we're seconds away from it being done in the Senate. And so in that sense, it's pretty set in stone, but there's always the possibility that something else may come up as they're considering amendments, if they are able to get any more amendments, which is in doubt today, or that when the House moves over, or when the bill moves over to the House, that the House could demand some changes. So anyhow, just to give you a sense of like, we're in a good spot, we're moving forward, but we're not done yet. So all of this is sort of subject to change as we move forward. But I think this is the bulk of the framework and hopefully what becomes law later this fall. Jason, anything else to add on context before I keep going?
Nope, doing great.
Okay, so some of the things you might see in the press, because the press really does need a story besides like, yay, this is money. They also want to sort of highlight some of the things that aren't in the bill. So I think it's really important to remind folks that this is a great bill. This is really good for folks. It is not everything we wanted. It's not the $2 trillion that the president asked for, but it is a historic, gargantuan amount of funding that is going to go into our infrastructure. It also is the long-term surface transportation reauthorization that is the baseline for all of our highway and transit and our regional planning money. It is the bread and butter that we do in the transportation world. And so that package is incorporated within the scope of these 2,700 pages in the bill. And it's also excitingly creates a lot of new programs. Many of the new programs are multimodal. They actually, a lot of what we've heard from Adrian and Clint really blends nicely with what this bill looks at the national level. And so I think beyond some of the priorities we focused on to date, that this will have a lot of opportunities for the region. Give you a sense, this isn't all transportation, it's a host of infrastructure programs that are in the bill. Transportation is the bulk, it's almost 50% of the bill, which is huge. A lot of that's going to the Department of Transportation. So it's going to be a ton of work on their end. And while we're all really excited to see it going, it's also going to be it's going to take a little while for all the funding to start flowing once this bill passes, because it's just a massive amount of work for them to send this much funding out the door. Just to flow through some of the other sections, there's big resiliency funding. That's the purple at the top, a lot on our electric grid, ton of broadband funding, both for urban and rural areas, and then clean water, drinking water, wastewater. And then finally at the bottom, you'll see just a little bit on the port side. All of this funding is what folks consider in DC to be hard infrastructure. We'll talk a little bit at the end about something they call soft infrastructure or family infrastructure. That's a separate bill, but they're related. So we'll come back to that. But this is all the hard infrastructure pieces that are part of our sort of core traditional programs. This is to give you a sense of how the bill compares. The FAST Act, that's the bill that we're living under right now. That was passed 5 or 6 years ago by Congress. It's, you can see it's in a 230 range of funding, and you can see the various different colors of types of money that were included in that bill: highway, transit, rail. And then the Invest Act, this is the House, that center column, that's the House passed bill. This gets a lot of press because the House, but this was a huge investment by the House. And then you can see the bipartisan deal. This is the one that's going to pass the Senate. And so just looking at these 3 columns, you can see that this bipartisan deal is sort of a surprisingly good bill. People were applauding the Invest Act, which was huge. FAST Act was the biggest bill of its time in the past when it passed 5 or 6 years ago. And so we're right in line with what folks would consider to be a very huge investment, absent some of the policy pieces folks liked better in the Invest Act than they do in the bipartisan bill. But this is sort of the nature of getting a bipartisan bill passed. Just as a reminder, the Senate is 50-50, very challenging to get big things done, really challenging to get agreement on anything. And so having this big of a bill come out of a 50-50 Senate, I don't think Jason and I would have taken that bet. I mean, Jason's more of a gambling man than I am, but I don't think I would have taken that bet. Some of the big things to highlight are just the relative size of the programs. The rail and transit increases are
Speaking of broadband connectivity, I think that Devin lost her broadband, so I will pick it up as she's reconnecting. The rail investment is significant. Part of it is compared to the Invest Act, it is what came down the most, but it's still historic in nature and how much money is going to rail. Same thing with transit. We are talking about upwards of more than a 50% increase in the overall transit funding as well as the highway funding. Much of the money is continuing through the formulas that that you all and your team know and love, CMAC, STP, as well as some of the other programs that are part of the plan here. And unfortunately, I can't share my screen, but I do have the slides in front of me. So I will go continue on here. And I'm sure this information will be passed along. A couple of things of note that are of particular attention to SACOG is on the highway side, they include $7.5 billion for electric vehicle infrastructure. Will help regions like SACOG create corridors, create electric vehicle charging stations, and help to adapt and begin to transfer into a more electric society. One of the big things that we worked on is resiliency. This is obviously a huge issue with climate change and impacting with fires and earthquakes and everything else that is happening. They included in the infrastructure package $7.3 billion. That comes in both a mix of formula funding and competitive grant funding. I think this is imperative because obviously with formula dollars, the region will be able to have a firm grasp of how much money it'll have for the next 5 years and even beyond in terms of addressing some of its resiliency components. But at the same time, there are certain aspects of protecting infrastructure where projects are considered mega projects, for lack of better words, and absent a competitive grant program would possibly take up an entire region's formula allocation. So we're very glad that the Protect grants are both a mix of competitive and formula dollars. Again, same thing with bridges. Congress put a lot of effort into making sure our bridges are in a state of good repair. Obviously, we've got a number of high-profile cases recently where bridges have fallen down or have become so structurally deficient that people cannot drive over them. And here in the East Coast, major corridors where bridges have literally been unusable. So they have included $40 billion in both competitive, again, and formula grants for bridges. There are some other programs that are new, a congestion relief initiative that is $250 million designed specifically for regional governments to bring in a variety of congestion relief initiatives that are not capitally based. There are pricing, ability to use pricing, innovation, a lot of things that Adrian was talking about earlier. One of the benefits of this program is it is discretionary and it's only for regions with a million people or more. So it's really focused on helping some of the largest urban areas address congestion. There's also sort of a counter to the urban congestion relief program, not listed here, but also included is a $300 million a year rural access program that is really focused on large rural access programs. This legislation definitely did not forget rural areas. There's a lot of set-asides within many of these programs to ensure that rural communities are addressed, and SACOG representing both urban and rural parts of the region. Certainly, both are urban and rural programs, I think, sense. I'll conclude on the highway side that the carbon emission reduction program is a program that goes to states but 65% of the money must be allocated to urban areas in coordination with the MPO. So the MPO in effect has a large say, and if not control, over how to spend that money. This is a very, very important program that I think will allow SACOG to continue with Green Means Go and use some federal dollars for Green Means Go. And I think that goes to a lot of the discussion in these bills is we worked very hard to tweak the language and to work the language in a way to make sure that what your priorities are in the region can be addressed through these programs. I think we did a fairly good job in ensuring that. There's a few things I think we would have liked to have seen expanded upon, particularly in the infill area, but certainly have made gigantic strides. And as we work with the administration to implement many of these programs, we'll be able to work with, I think, a very friendly administration to be able to use these dollars in the most flexible way possible. Understanding we're a little tight on time here, I'll simply say that the transit program again grew significantly, an 80% increase over existing funding, with many of those dollars going through the core programs. One of the things that Devin did not mention, but I will mention, is that highway reauthorization was a result of the negotiations that have already taken place between Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. There was no transit title. There was not a transit bill to work off of like there was a highway bill. And if actually that became a part of the process where the transit title, as they call it, is actually incredibly small. There is very little new in form of transit policy. What they did is they agreed to disagree and instead just funded the existing transit program. Very, very minor changes, almost I'll say inconsequential changes, especially for our region in the transit title. So effectively, they just added a ton of more money with a lot of focus on state of good repair, low emission buses, and things of that nature. Again, having an 80% increase, I think will allow. I think one of the disappointing things is that, as I heard some of your earlier presentations, looking at microtransit, some other options, I think there was some hope that the transit title would have been amended to adapt and encourage more of those technologies to be integrated to support transit, but that did not happen. But that does not prevent regions from taking their own steps to sort of make that innovation happen. The last thing I'll sort of touch on very briefly is the fact that there are very large discretionary pots of money that are available. In many ways, these three pots of money overlap with one another just because of what they are and who they are. But I will be very blunt and tell you that when three very strong senators have their version of what a mega projects program would look like, it turned out that instead of picking between the three, they just created three new programs. One is as familiar, the Tiger Build Raise, that will receive $7.5 billion, which is significantly greater than what's currently there. And that will be for projects up to grants up to $25 million. We have the Infra program, which is a more of a freight and a rail program, but also includes elements of highway repair and multimodalism. That will receive $8 billion. And then there's a mega projects pot of money, which is $5 billion. And that will be for projects with between 100 million and 500 million in terms of the grant sizes. So you have a lot of sort of new pots of money that we can engage and attack projects. I'll also say with all three of those programs, additional money is possible through the appropriation process. All of the money we've just talked about is guaranteed. There are a handful of programs where money is called authorized to be appropriated, which means that the future Congresses can decide if they want to add more money to the program. And all three of these projects I just mentioned are subject to that. I will also say this bill is, again, 2,700 pages, a lot of funding for broadband, $40 billion that will go to the states, an additional $1 billion that will go to middle mile solutions, making use of the right of way. I know it's something that this SACOG has cared about in the past. The one thing I will say is not a whole lot dedicated to housing. We think there's a possibility that that will be something addressed to some extent in what Devin alluded to, which would be called the reconciliation package, which is a $3.5 billion soft infrastructure program that will be very partisan and will begin this fall in earnest. So that is, in short, and hopefully I think it was a little over 10 minutes, 2,702 pages. We will have a much higher level of detail once the ink is dry and we're able to go through. But I will simply say, in general, what does this mean for SACOG? This is a historic investment. We were able to help sort of shape it in a way that I think will allow this body to use the money that we'll be getting. It will be getting a significant increase of funding, not just through formula dollars that it's used to getting, but I think for the new programs that are both formula and discretionary. So we think that there's certainly strides made, strides that are left to be taken, but I think we're pretty proud of work that's in here, and I think we're pretty glad of what we hope will be the final conclusion. So with that, certainly took more time than intended. I will stop there and be more than happy to answer any questions.
Jason, Devin, thank you. And Jason, thanks for jumping right in there and underlining the broadband need that we all have as we move forward. A question on reconciliation, and can you just give us like the 90-second version of, so the bill passes Senate in the next couple of days, where we go from here and how reconciliation kind of overlays that process?
So the process is a little bit clearer now. So this bipartisan package, which includes the reauthorization, service transportation reauthorization, will now effectively go to the House. The House will, assuming it passes, and I think at this point, all signs are, and I'm knocking on wood and any other superstition I can do, that this will pass unscathed. Once it goes to the House, it will be up to the House to decide whether it wants to pass it as is or amend it. Generally speaking, the wide consensus is that will be a very strong push to have the House pass this legislation as is as quickly as possible. What that does mean is the earmarks that were in the House bill are not included. So that is just something that we did talk about now, but earmarks were not included in the Senate package. They were included in the House. They were not added. So there's, that is something, just a point of notice. If the House were to make changes to the bill, it would then have to come back to the Senate for another vote. There will be a strong amount of pressure put on Speaker Pelosi to just pass this, celebrate it, come back and fight another day for other priorities. I am not the speaker. I don't get to make that choice, but she is standing pretty firm that she will not take up the transportation bill until a reconciliation package, which again is more partisan, has more of a progressive tinge to it, passes the Senate. And there is some question on whether one can. But I do feel at the end of the day, my guess is that the House will take up the infrastructure package, will pass it. I will note that the Senate is passing what is known as budget instructions, effectively creates the shell for reconciliation. I think that might be enough for Speaker Pelosi to say, okay, positive steps have been taken, my demands have been met, and then pass the infrastructure package. But
yeah, we probably don't know the answer, and I don't think they know the answer until they can see the votes. But yeah, it is also possible we go into the fall before these two bills can move together.
Okay, thank you. I think that was, to see when and how, or at least the timing of it, with all the politics wrapped up around the reconciliation bill. Yeah. Colleagues, any questions, comments?
Really appreciate the update. That was so, we're all watching the news and, trying to follow this, and it's really helpful to hear the latest and greatest on insights on this. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of greatness in there. It's just tough to cover in 15 minutes. 2,700 pages in 15 minutes is it's probably the toughest challenge we've had in this.
No, we appreciate it, Jason, Devin, especially jumping right in on behalf of SACOG. and really making sure that we have a presence, and we will continue to have that presence going forward, as those, not only the programmatic dollars, but those those dollars are going to be competitive for us. So I think hugely important for your efforts that are going on the Hill and with the administration. So thank you for that. Okay, with that then, we'll go back to Sabrina for a state update.
Yes, thank you. Seeing the time, I will be super brief. I mostly wanted to touch on two key pieces of the budget that the governor signed on July 12th. There were, by July 16th, when the legislature went out to recess, there were at least 50 budget-related bills that moved through the legislature. So there's a lot happening there, and there's still going to be more trailer bill language required to fully enact the state budget. So there's some information that CalCog prepared on what some key areas of interest are for regional agencies, but I wanted to touch on transportation funding in particular and Green Means Go funding. So on transportation funding, there's nearly $6 billion in additional funding for investments in rail, transit, active transportation, safety, and road improvements. The release of those funds is contingent upon additional trailer bill language that seems to be caught up in negotiations with the governor over $4.2 billion in high-speed rail funding. The budget-related bills will have until August 27th to make it through both appropriations committees. So we will have some update for you at that point in terms of what's moving forward to get through the legislature by September 10th. And then on Green Means Go, as James mentioned earlier in the meeting, we were successful in getting approximately $34 million in funding for the region through the Regional Early Action Planning Grant Program, REAP 2021, that is part of AB 140. There's an attachment that has more information there for you. So while this wasn't the $100 million that we were seeking, it is significant that our efforts resulted in garnering these funds, and no doubt exists in large part due to our advocacy efforts. And we're going to continue to look for additional opportunities to secure more funding at the state and local levels. James can talk a bit more about that. James, I don't know if you want to jump in now. I wanted to touch on 375 bills, but want to do a time check as well. So keep going. Okay. We do have three bills that were related to SB 375 amendments. There's AB 1147 by Friedman, SB 261 by Allen, and SB 475 by Cortese. AB 1147 is the one of the three that is still moving through the legislature this session. We're continuing to track that and engage with Friedman's office. It would have created an SCS block program for projects that implement and align with SCSs in their regions. But the AB 140, the REAP 2021 language, will replace that SCS block program, but there are still some additional reporting requirements that get at SCS implementation. So we'll be tracking those and keep you posted on discussions. The other two bills are 2-year bills now. Cortese and Allen's offices have formed a working group with staff from environmental quality and transportation committees to have some joint discussions on those. So they've reached out to SACOG and other MPOs to continue those discussions on amendments to those bills that would then potentially be move forward in next session. And with that, James, would you like to add anything before we open it up to questions?
I think just given the time, we'll go to questions. Thanks.
All right. Okay. Any questions, comments? All right. People are shy today. Sabrina, thank you for the report. And I also want to just do a shout out to KP Public Affairs as well for all their efforts on the Green Means Go front. It isn't without their help and SACOG staff and everybody here to really push this program forward, that turned it really into a statewide program. with our allocated amount in there. I don't know if it would have happened without that. It's certainly, they took our idea and made it into something that everyone across the state can get in on as well. So that's always, like, I think, a good thing when you're sort of hijacked and it turns into a state program. So, or at least a state initiative in this case. So again, thank you for all the work on that, and for continuing to look at those 375 bills as well. I think those could potentially be something where we really want to get on that discussion, depending on where those 2-year bills end up with conversations over once session's out.
Chair Saragosa, just to then add on to your comments, since there aren't other directors' comments, I am absolutely convinced there wouldn't be a $600 million program without this region's efforts around Great Means Go. It would not have happened if you didn't all weigh in and send letters and make those phone calls. It wouldn't have happened if your jurisdictions hadn't designated green zones. Many of you, right? I know not all, but many of you, so that when the legislature says, well, what is this? Well, I mean, what would you even spend this money on? We had geographies, we had local council resolutions and Board of Soups, we had areas, we had projects, we had infrastructure needs. We did our homework and we made the case. And yes, I wanted the whole 100 million, as we all did, for our pilot program. We couldn't pull that off. I think that's good for us to, as we go forward, to think a little bit about, is that, why couldn't we deliver something just for our region? But I will also say there are very few things that unites our entire delegation across all 6 counties. And this one did. And because of that, we were able to be successful. So thanks again.
Thank you, James. And again, colleagues, if there's you just wanted to put the plug out there too, if there's a policy initiative or a piece of legislation that you all think we should be taking a look at, please let James, myself, or staff know. We'll definitely have conversations about that too. So with that, we have a receive and file. And so everyone, please take a look at that on our contract reports. And with that, 11:57, I'll give everybody back 3 minutes of their time. I will see everyone at the Board of Directors meeting, and hope everybody has a good rest of your week.
Chair Saragosa, just one note
Yes.
on that. It is a short meeting next Thursday because of the GSEC board meeting. And so those of you that are on the GSEC board, we worked with them. So they start at 10:30. You'll have 9:30 to 10:30 for the board business, at least the action item. So just so you know, it'll be a little shorter, no workshop this time, so we can dovetail with GSEC.
Great. Thank you, James. Okay, with that, everyone enjoy your week, and I'll talk to you all soon. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.